So many of you don't know this, but I spend years and years and years building with this technology. Hi, my name is Nick Cosentino, and I'm a Principal Software Engineering Manager at Microsoft. Before ASP.NET Core and everything else was becoming very popular, everything was kind of going to the web application side of things, I spent tons of time building desktop applications for Windows. This started off with WinForms for many years, and then from there we went over to WPF. That's Windows Presentation Foundation. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through some very basics of WPF, going back to some of my roots, and talking about some of the things that I really like and some of the things that I don't. This is with respect to the framework and how it guides you to coding along with it. A quick reminder that if you like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel and check out that pinned comment for my courses on DomeTrain. With that said, let's go make a new WPF project. On my screen, I'm just in Visual Studio here. I've gone to select a new project to create. We're going to select a WPF application. I have it in the left bar here, but you can go ahead and search WPF and select WPF application. So go ahead and do that. I am going to name mine WPF Playground Sample Application for the project, and I'm going to make a new solution just called WPF Playground, because, spoiler alert, I'm going to make some more videos about this content, and we'll expand upon this. Once I go ahead and create this, we're going to use .NET 8. We will get a new application, and it's very basic, but I'm going to walk you through some of the pieces that we have here because, again, if you've not used WPF, you've never seen this stuff before, this is just a very lightweight intro video to some of the things that we have going on here. So the first thing that you'll notice is that we have a visual editor here, right? We have a preview of what main window looks like in this case. That is going to be, as you might expect, the main window of our desktop application. But you can see that my screen is already divided into two. Now, I do have code on the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this part so we can see a little bit more code. But we have the preview up top and the code on the bottom. But the code that you're seeing is not like C# code. This is what we call XAML, XAML. And this is going to be the markup language that we use for creating WPF applications. So the first thing that you'll notice is that there's just a ton of what looks like namespaces, because that's essentially what these are, namespaces at the top here. We have a class name that we're giving this window, right? So if I go split this out a little bit more, we can see that it becomes maybe slightly more readable, but these are the different properties and things that we can go configure on this window. And of course, there are many more to go play around with, and we're not going to go dive into every single control and everything that's on the window for properties and things like that. I just want to show you that this is sort of the different pieces that we have to work with here. So main window preview up top, we have the XAML in the bottom. You can go ahead and change things like I can put dev leader here, right? So you can see that automatically the title updates. If I go run this, and we're going to look at other pieces of this, by the way, but I just want to show you that if we go run this, I don't know if my hot reload is enabled, but we might be able to get something like that going on here. So maybe I will put my name here. You can see that I just went ahead and saved it, and it did hot reload the XAML, right? So I put Nick instead of dev leader as the title. If I go ahead and put that back, there's no editing tricks here. I'm just alt-tabbing in between, so my video editor is not trying to make this all get put together. I know he could, but I'm not trying to trick you, right? We do have hot reloading with WPF in Visual Studio, which is awesome because if you're trying to play around with some designing, it makes it a lot easier than having to go play around with it in the preview, and then maybe when you go run the application, it's behaving a little bit differently than you expect. So this is a very nice feature that we have to work with. I'll go ahead and stop this though. The other thing that we get in WPF, and if you're familiar with WinForms before WPF, and it's not unique to either of these two frameworks, but we do have the ability to have drag and drop. So my toolbox on the left-hand side here, I can go ahead and I could go add a label or something onto here. So I can go click this label. You can see that the XAML is automatically updated, right? So there's a content property. It added in some horizontal alignment, just some basic stuff. Like I didn't put any of this on here. It just did it automatically when I dropped it in, right? So you can see that it tried to do some left horizontal alignment, but vertical alignment to the center. Now that seems kind of weird because it looks like it's centered overall, but that's because there's a margin here. Now it's truly left aligned. I can go put this to the center now too. Now it's truly in the center, right? And then we can go put Nick as the label, just as an example, right? So you do get this visual editor, which is very nice. The other thing that I want to show you is that it's very common for almost, all of the things that we have that have a XAML suffix, so the file name is XAML, there is a code behind C# file. In the Solution Explorer on the left, you'll notice I have main window.xaml. Visual Studio kind of does a bit of a UI trick here for you where it collapses them together. So main window XAML, if I expand it, we have main window XAML.cs. And I can go to this file if I double click it to open it, and you can see that we do have code here, right? This is the main window class we were looking at, but you'll notice that it's partial. It's partial because we're going to have code generation that takes the XAML and goes and creates the other pieces of the code for this main window. It's just that you're not seeing it in this file. I'm going to go ahead and remove a lot of these extra usings just to make this a little bit more readable, but you'll see, right, we have a main window, that's the name of our class, and it inherits from window. So very much like WinForms and other control libraries, this is a pretty common thing where we have this hierarchy of controls. If you are familiar with things like composition versus inheritance, a lot of the time UI frameworks lean heavily into inheritance. Not something that I'm a huge fan of, but it's just a very common thing that we see with UI frameworks. So main window itself inherits from this window base class. And then you can see that we have this constructor on here that has initialize component. This is, again, if you're familiar with WinForms, this is a way that we can basically ask the class to go set up all of the things that we see. If we go back over to main window XAML, all the stuff that you're seeing here, calling initialize component will essentially get that set up for us at runtime. Just wanted to call out that a lot of the time you will see a XAML file coupled with a .cs file. I'm going to go show you one more part before I start talking about some of the things that I like about WPF and maybe some things that I would like us to move away from just because they seem like anti-patterns, but unfortunately that's the way the framework is set up. So you end up sort of fighting against the framework if you're trying to achieve some of these other patterns. So I'll get into that in just a moment. But before we move on, this is just a reminder that I do have courses available on DomeTrain if you want to level up in your C# programming. If you head over to DomeTrain, you can see that I have a course bundle that has my getting started and deep dive courses on C#. Between the two of these, that's 11 hours of programming in the C# language, taking you from absolutely no programming experience to being able to build basic applications. You'll learn everything about variables, loops, a bit of async programming, and object-oriented programming as well. Make sure to check it out. If we go over to appxaml.cs and appxaml, you can see that appxaml is, again, it's just another XAML file, right? Not something that you're going to see. And it's kind of interesting that if we go look at appxaml.cs, it's very similar to the window one, but the difference is that this is not a UI control. It's an application that we're inheriting from. If I go into application, you can see that if I keep going into here, there's nothing along the hierarchy that is like a UI element. The app itself, in this case, our specific type is called app, but it inherits from a base application. This is not a UI element. This is just the entry point to our application, and that's the entry point in all WPF applications is going to be application. The other part, if we go to app.xaml, is that you'll notice that we do have a XAML file associated with it, which is kind of weird because I think for a lot of us that are working in WPF, or even the first example I showed you where the main window has this visual editor, and you get the preview, you don't get that here. For app.xaml, you don't have that. It's just a markup file that goes along with it. As you can see here, this is just the default. We do have a resource collection that we can go have resources for our application. Things like strings, styles, graphics, stuff like that, you can drop into your resources. The other thing to pay attention to is that there is a startup URI. And the startup URI points at the main window in this case. That's going to be the thing that we launch when we go to run this application, right? So that's what the startup URI is. If we remove that, what happens, right? Let's go run this now. It's running, right? You might not know, you can't tell, but the application is running, but it doesn't know what to go do, right? There isn't a window or anything else to go launch. It basically is running the application and it's going, okay, I'm doing what you said, right? The startup URI is telling us that we need to go have this as the control. If I go run this again, you'll see it fixes it, right? So it knows, go put up this main window. Okay, so we have that. We can see that this is a pretty empty thing here. If you wanted to do some initialization logic, I think a lot of us are, well, depending on when you started, you might be used to something like a program.cs file, and then you would have something like a public class. Was Copilot going to do it for me? There you go. You have something like this. It might have a static void main. Don't worry about the STA thread for just the point of this conversation. You might have something like string params here, right? Even have an int return type, but we're used to having something like this as our entry point. You're not getting that with WPF. This is kind of hidden from us. Like I was saying, some of us, depending on when you started in C#, you might not have even seen this kind of thing, because we do have top level statements now where you can basically just write your code at the top of the application, literally return 0, or console write line hello world is a full program on its own. But historically we had this kind of thing, and all that I'm trying to point out is that we don't have that in WPF. It's not explicit, but if you wanted to have some initialization logic, there's a couple things you could do. So the first is on the app in the constructor. We don't need initialize component here, but you could do some initialization if I could type, right? So that's one place you can do it. That's in the constructor though. So you might want to think about what truly belongs in the constructor. And then you have this on startup, sorry. So you have this, which is almost like an event handler. It's not quite. If you wanted to do an event handler, there is also an event handler that you could do. And that didn't go and make, come on, Visual Studio. There we go. Thank you. So you can do an event handler, you can do the override, and you can use a constructor. These are all tools that you have to use to do some startup logic. They will have nuances, some differences between them. So something to think about, right? Just wanted to point out that if you're like, hey, I made an app in WPF, where the heck is the entry point? How do I add some startup code? Here you go. Here's 3 different variations of how you can do that. So I'm not going to go into the details of those. I'm just pointing out some things to you. Before I show you some things that I would like to move away from, I'm going to start by showing you a couple of things that you can leverage in WPF. And I wanted to start by showing you a pattern that's pretty common. So depending on what types of UI frameworks you've used, you might have heard of something called MVC, which is Model View Controller. In WPF, the pattern that gets used is Model View View Model. The way that we try to approach this kind of stuff in WPF is like, instead of hard coding stuff right into the XAML, we can actually do what's called binding to a view model. What that looks like is that here we could go do binding. So you can see the syntax with the curly braces, binding, and then the thing that we want to go bind to. So we have something like this. And you might say, well, where does that come from? Or we could do, you can see that as I'm typing it, the autocomplete is not picking that up. And it's because it doesn't know where that exists. And that's because right now it doesn't exist anywhere. But where it will be looking for the thing that I'm typing at runtime is off of the data context. And this isn't something we've talked about yet. The data context is a property that you can assign onto your control. So in this case, the main window, we can go make a data context, which is just, well, I shouldn't say just, it's not quite just a data transfer object, but a very basic view model in this case would be a data transfer object, which is just something that has some properties. The one that we're going to make in just a moment is a very basic DTO data transfer object. So we will go make one that has a custom title, and then we'll see that we can go assign it. If you look in my preview right now, you'll notice that there is no title there now, right? Because it doesn't know where to pull custom title from. It can't show anything. What I'm going to do is go over to main window XAML.cs just to go create the view model. Okay, so we have that, and I did call it custom title, but this isn't enough. We've just gone ahead and made a class. We're not using it anywhere, and that's the part that we have to go do. So the data context on a control, in this case main window, is mutable, and it's mutable from the outside. It's also mutable from the inside. So we can go assign a data context to be like this. There's no dependency injection in this case. I'm just newing up a new main window view model directly inside of here. Again, if I go back to the preview, you can see, hey, look, nothing fancy going on here. We don't have a title, but if I go run this, you can see that the title is hello world. So that binding is taking place. The title equals binding custom title. It's pulling the custom title property. If I go back to here, it's pulling that custom title property off of this main window view model, which is assigned to the data context. To do one more quick example, we had this label here. I'm going to go do binding custom label. And that means we have to go make that property now. So we'll put custom label here, and I'm going to put some string in here. Obviously, you would all agree with that, right? Dev leader rocks. Let's go see. Hey, look, boom, the binding takes place for us. So I just wanted to show you that in WPF, the binding part that we have in the XAML, the way that it works is that the part that you are binding to is going to be off of the data context. Now, without going into a super deep dive on all of these things, because there's so much to explore here, bindings can get incredibly complicated. You can do things like binding elements like in a list control to a list that is in code. Then you have to figure out how you map those objects to be displayed in the UI. There are things where you want to do a binding and you need to convert the value. So maybe you have a set of enums or something that's on a property. If that enum is set to a particular value, you want to be able to hide or disable something. You need to be able to convert that enum value into a visual state, and that needs a value converter. So there's lots of stuff that you can do with bindings. You can do bindings to other control properties instead of just the data context. So this kind of stuff can get incredibly complicated. This is going to lead me to a couple of things that I want to talk about that I'm not a huge fan of in WPF in terms of some of the patterns that it pushes us into. The first one is going to be that as awesome as it is to go define all of this stuff in XAML, you're not writing code, you're writing in the markup language. So it's not like you have to go put all the logic in here, right? I'm not writing if statements and loops and things like that. For some people, it's very nice because you have this markup language to work with. You can go make reusable bindings and things like that, or the value converters, all that stuff. And you can have it with your nice preview window. But in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges is that if we want to go test this kind of stuff, the more things that you put into your XAML, the harder it becomes to go test. What I mean by that is the more stuff that is in your XAML, the more that you need to be able to run your application and have it visually showing you what's happening. Truly, you need to be able to, say, show a window for the bindings to go take place. That means if you wanted to test that your control is in the right state, you need to be able to show it. And that means that the types of tests that you can write are much more limited. It's not that it's wrong. It's not that there's no way to test it. It's just that it restricts the type of testing that you are able to do. One of the ways that I've worked around this historically is that the more things you see inside of XAML, the more things I start to pull out. So I've gone as far as even having the bindings done in the code behind, where we go create a binding object and basically move away from having almost anything in the XAML. It does mean that you lose a ton of the benefits, but for us, in some of the situations we had, we wanted to make sure that we could test what the user interface was doing without having to go launch something, have it click through, do, you can do like screenshot testing, or there's tons of other types of tests you can do, but we didn't want to have to go show the user interface to test a bunch of stuff. We took that pattern to an extreme. I think there's probably a happy middle ground, but in my opinion, the more stuff that you put into XAML, the harder it becomes to test. So that's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to mention, if I go back into the code here, it has to do with the data context and view models. The thing that I'm not a huge fan of is that the way that WPF guides us into creating user interfaces, I feel like it is done from the control itself down to the code behind. And what I mean by that is that when we are working in WPF, it's kind of like you are driven by the controls that you're working in versus having some background code or some back-end code that knows how to go show the elements properly. You can absolutely design it the way that I just said. In fact, that's the direction I try to go in, but it feels like you are fighting against the framework to do it. One of the ways that we see this happen is if we look at the constructor here for main window. If you're not familiar with dependency injection, I'll kind of explain it as I'm talking about this problem, but a lot of the time, what I don't want to do is have mutable controls. I don't want someone to go create the main window and then go assign the data context. I also don't want to have to go new up my view model inside of here. What I would like to be able to do is have a main window view model passed in. This is the behavior that I want everyone to have to use. And I would love for this data context to basically be a read only. So you go assign the data context. Now it's assigned for the lifetime of this control. In my opinion, if we enforce this type of rule, I think that it would make for a lot more what I might call clean code in WPF. I don't like saying the word clean because I think that's very subjective. And in fact, this is just my opinion, so it is subjective. But the reason that I like doing this is that you can have weird things going on where people reassign the data context. And instead, I think the pattern that's more beneficial is that you have, if anything, a mutable view model. So you can do things that will adjust the state of your view model. That way you don't have to interact with the control itself for changing any other state explicitly. We do that, of course, through the bindings. Again, if you're able to pass in the view model, you can assign it to the data context. Your data bindings should take care of the rest of the things that you want your view to do with respect to your view model. But this pattern isn't really something that you see encouraged in a lot of WPF code. A lot of the time you'll see things get made and then data context assigned from the outside. Personal opinion, but I think that this would have been a nice way to kind of enforce that we go create controls. With that said, I do think that WPF is a very powerful desktop development framework. I have used it extensively for many years. It's been a few years since I've had to go develop in it though, but I do think that it's something that if you're interested in making desktop applications, WPF is a great option. Of course, there is Maui, which I have not spent time with, that is cross-platform, much newer, and it also leverages XAML. So I've heard people say that, if you're familiar with XAML and WPF, it can be transferable to Maui, but I don't have the experience yet working in Maui. Now, if you're interested in seeing how I start to address some of these challenges that I was calling out, especially with the main window and the data context, and how we might be able to leverage dependency injection, you can go ahead and check out this video next. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.